And GZERO's here at the IMF World Bank spring meetings. Ayhan Kose is the Chief Deputy Economist of the World Bank. When last we spoke, last year, good to see you by the way.
Thank you.
The big fear was global recession.
Yeah.
Now that seems to have cooled a bit, for sure, but recovery seems uneven at best. Is that a fair encapsulation of it?
Indeed, when we discussed these issues last year, there was the expectation of deeper downturn, and of course the inflation scare was there. Since then, incoming data was much better than what we expected, what others expected, and there has been surprising resilience around the world, and inflation has been coming down. These are all good news. But what you mentioned is critical. The recovery remains uneven in the sense that, of course, when we look at the big countries like the US is doing very well, India, China delivering good growth rates, Indonesia. But then there is this, in a sense, other side of this coin, and we are looking at the poorest and most vulnerable economies, and they are not doing well.
In fact, you even brought a report on that. I feel like a morning show host, but I'll hold up your book here. So when we talk about the poorest countries, the 75 poorest countries, the wealth gap is widening exponentially. What are the reasons for that and what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, so when we think about what happened over the past 4 years, we had one shock after another, starting with the pandemic, of course, the inflation shock, interest rate shock, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, latest developments in the Middle East. You put all of these together, these developments took a toll on basically these poorest and most vulnerable economies. They don't have the fiscal coffers to respond when food price goes up, price of oil goes up. That has significant implications for these economies. So where we are now, over the past basically 4 years, when you look at 2020-24, they registered the weakest growth rate on average since the 1990s. And when you look at basically the gap, income gap between these economies, the poorest and most vulnerable, and the wealthiest economies, what we want that gap to close. We want incomes, per capita incomes, to increase in these economies. And of course, exactly the opposite start happening. And it's not just the aggregate observation. You look at half of these countries, they are becoming poorer relative to wealthiest economies. 1/3 of these countries basically have now per capita income lower than 2019. And there are other things. I mean, when you think about, for example, poverty, eliminating poverty is a kind of a fundamental goal, and 70% of global poor live in these countries. We didn't talk about food insecurity. We have been talking about food security quite a bit over the past 2-3 years. More than 90% of food insecure people live in these 75 countries. And of course, they have very serious fiscal problems. Half of them are in debt risk, very serious, or they are about to fall into debt distress. So the picture is quite concerning.
To give people a really concrete example, I read that in these poorest countries, per capita incomes can be as low as $1,300 a year.
Yeah.
Right? So that gives people a sense of the kind of poverty that we're talking about. Obviously, World Bank's central mission, eradication of poverty, development, a large initiative you have is IDA, International Development Association. Tell me what it is and what it does.
So the International Development Association is part of the World Bank Group with a very specific mandate, and it has been around for a very long time, and it is providing grants and concessional, very low interest rate loans to these 75 poorest and most vulnerable economies. What happened over the past basically 4 years, IDA continue to provide net inflows to these countries, while basically the private sector, the private flows dried up because of the debt problems I mentioned. Of course, some of these countries ended up defaulting. It is going to be critical for the global community to continue to make sure IDA is powerful enough to help.
How does geopolitics play in this? Because obviously we're talking about an enormously fragmented world right now and an increasingly fragmented economy. So when you talk about getting the wealthiest nations on board to support IDA, does that come with challenges?
Of course, it comes with challenges, and geopolitics does not help. There is no question about that. There are very serious tensions in different parts of the world. Fiscal positions of these wealthiest economies also are quite constrained. But the big picture remains the same. As much as there are serious problems, as we document, there is a great reversal in development. These countries have incredible potential. Let me talk a little bit about that, because that's why it is critical for the global community to basically provide the help. One reason is this demographic transition we see, advanced economies, emerging markets. These economies are going to age. They are not going to bring the type of working age population that is necessary in the coming decades. Where that working age population, young people are going to come from these 75 countries. In fact, during the next 5 decades, IDA countries will bring young workers to the global labor force while we see aging in the rest of the world. So you need to make sure these people have good education, these people have health services, and these people are equipped to basically help everywhere around the world, advanced economies, big emerging markets, to have this digital transition we are going through. The second reason is that when you think about natural resources, when you think about minerals essential for climate transition, these countries have a lot of them. They have incredible reservoir of renewable energy, solar energy. And of course, the third reason, Tony, at the end of the day, history is full of examples. China, India, Indonesia, Chile, Korea, they all used to be IDA borrowers. They were poorer countries. They became, much richer. In fact, Chile is a high-income country. All these economies, India, Korea, China, major powerhouses. So there is no reason these current countries, as you mentioned, per capita income below 350, not to repeat what we have seen in the context of China, India, Indonesia, or Korea. But they won't be able to deal with the climate problem. They are most exposed to climate-related natural disasters, and they won't be able to deal with other problems.
So staying a couple steps ahead of where the problem is going, you mentioned digital transformation, and while it's true that the youngest populations are in these emerging economies and could potentially become the labor force of tomorrow, there are also big fears about what technology and specifically AI will do to that labor force.
Yes.
Is that a factor that you're considering?
I think really we are considering now how to, in a sense, make sure we have sustained, stable, inclusive growth as well as green growth. How we can do that, how we can basically reduce the impact of climate change, get ahead of the global warming, and these countries provide for us fertile ground. Around the world, we are basically seeing structural growth slowing down. One reason is demographic transition, aging. How we are going to get ahead of that, slowdown? We need to make sure these countries are growing at healthy rates. So obviously the geopolitics, the technological developments in the context of AI space, critical. But at the end of the day, the reality on the ground, they need help, and that help has to come from the global community.
finally, any bright spot, a little bit of optimism as we end this conversation?
No. I think in general, I mentioned this remarkable resilience. Let me talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. U.S. economy has delivered phenomenal growth. When you think about the average growth U.S. delivered from 2010 to 2019, that's around 1.7, 1.8%. Look at the growth now. Last year, 2.5%. This year, it could be again close to that number. So the labor force participation rate, 2 decades high. The supply side of the U.S. economy delivering on the kind of the incredible way, and you see productivity picking up. And really, I mentioned, India, China, Indonesia delivering good growth. But at the end of the day, we need to put things in perspective. And when you put things in perspective, there is more that needs to be done. And we need to think about, how we are going to protect the rules-based international order, how we are going to build, the world economy that's going to basically be conducive to better growth, sustainable growth.
China's growth, good, not as good as you might have predicted a few years ago. Are they back on track after the zero COVID policy?
I think the Chinese policymakers understand the challenges in front of them. They are trying to basically formulate policies. There's a very serious, problem when it comes to consumer confidence. There's a very serious problem when it comes to real estate sector and the financial companies associated with that sector. China has the fiscal buffers to overcome these problems. And I think the bottom line is you saw the latest China numbers, surprise on the upside. So we would like to be optimistic, but at the end of the day, policies need to be in place to address these bigger problems, challenges the Chinese economy is facing.
Ayhan Kose, thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Tony.